Good morning, everybody, and welcome to CalRecycle's SB 619 Notification of Intent to Comply Form webinar. My name is Alan Osorio, and I am part of the SB 619 team at CalRecycle. Before we get started, our director, Rachel Maki-Wagner, would like to provide some high-level remarks. Director?
Good morning, and thank you so much, Alan, for the introduction. I'll keep it really short so we can get to the good stuff here. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I am very excited, optimistic, and hopeful about implementation of SB 619 and helping the state achieve our SB 1383 goals. And all of you who are attending today are really contributing to that hopefulness, because you are here to try to find a solution that is right for your jurisdiction. And really looking forward to the conversation and the questions today as we move forward with really strengthening our partnership and implementation of this incredibly important climate goal. I just want to share with you that I've had the opportunity over the last couple of weeks to talk to media stakeholders, industry stakeholders, community stakeholders, who are all really excited to see what California is able to achieve. And it has really been my pleasure to speak to the partnerships that we've been able to build between our local jurisdictions and the state jurisdictions. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Alan to kick off the day. And again, thank you all for being here, and I look forward to the conversation. Alan?
Thank you, Director. Before we go over the logistics for today's webinar, including the live Q&A, I want to introduce you to those who will be participating and/or will be available for questions after the presentation portion. At this point, I'd like to ask CalRecycle staff participating in today's webinar to turn their cameras on. Thank you, CalRecycle. CalRecycle, please wave when I call your name. I would like to first introduce Ashley Yee, the Branch Chief with Enforcement, Kara Morgan, the Branch Chief with Local Assistance and Market Development, and Kat Ferrer with the SB 619 team. Also joining us today is Jocelyn Arce, who will be assisting with the Q&A portion. Now, I will briefly turn it over to Jocelyn to go over the logistics for the Q&A. Jocelyn, CalRecycle team, you may turn off your cameras until the Q&A session, which will occur at the back end of today's webinar.
Thank you, Alan. Good morning, everyone. I will be going over the instructions for the Q&A session, which will follow the presentation. If you are using the GoToWebinar platform, please type your question into the question pane. If you are watching the webinar via the CaliPA broadcast, you may email your questions to noic@calrecycle.ca.gov. Staff will, or I will unmute participants in the order that questions come in so that you may read your question out loud. Note that you will need to unmute yourself on your end and go to webinar when asked to. Please state your affiliation before asking your question. For those watching via the broadcast, we will verbalize some of these questions and responses in the GoToWebinar platform for you to hear as well. CalRecycle staff may respond to some questions in writing through GoToWebinar, so please review the question pane for those responses. Questions and comments regarding the merit of the regulations were responded to during the rulemaking period. Today, we will focus on questions or clarifications regarding the SB 619 Notification of Intent to Comply. Back to you, Alan.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Again, my name is Alan, and today, both Kat and I will be presenting on CalRecycle's development of the SB 1383 Notification of Intent to Comply form. As background, jurisdictions are required to implement the SB 1383 regulations that went into effect January 1st, 2022. As jurisdictions are preparing to implement the regulations, many local governments are facing challenges in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In response, Governor Newsom signed SB 619, Laird, Chapter 508, Statutes 2021 into law to support local governments as they design and implement successful organic waste recycling programs throughout the state. The law authorizes CalRecycle to waive civil penalties if a jurisdiction submits a notification of intent to comply for some or all of the regulatory requirements and implements the planned actions and timelines. Upon approval by CalRecycle of a jurisdiction's notification and implementation by the jurisdiction, a jurisdiction may be eligible for both of the following. 1. Administrative civil penalty relief for the 2022 calendar year pursuant to Public Resources Code Section 42652.5D, and 2. A corrective action plan pursuant to Title 14 California Code of Regulations, Section 18996.2. CalRecycle may address, through a corrective action plan, any violations disclosed in a jurisdiction's notification that will take more than 180 days to correct. In this situation, the proposed actions and schedule in the jurisdiction's approved notification will be in effect until a corrective action plan is issued. The SB 619 process differs from the SB 1383 enforcement process in two major ways. The first way the process differs from SB 1383 enforcement process is civil penalties. In the SB 619 process, CalRecycle will waive administrative civil penalties for the 2022 calendar year for violations disclosed in a jurisdiction's approved notification of intent to comply, if the jurisdiction implements the proposed actions to remedy the violations in accordance with the schedule provided by the jurisdiction in the notification. For violations commencing during the 2022 calendar year and continuing into the 2023 calendar year, administrative civil penalties will begin accruing January 1, 2023, but if CalRecycle exercises its discretion to put a jurisdiction on a corrective action plan, any penalties may be waived upon a determination of full compliance with the terms of the corrective action plan. In the SB 1383 enforcement process, penalties may begin accruing for violations occurring in 2022. The second way the process differs from the SB 1383 enforcement process is eligibility for a corrective action plan. In the SB 619 process, for violations identified in the notification of intent to comply, CalRecycle may address any violations disclosed through a corrective action plan that will take more than 180 days to correct. A jurisdiction is not required to demonstrate a substantial effort to be eligible for a corrective action plan through the notification of intent to comply process. In the SB 1383 enforcement process, CalRecycle may exercise its enforcement discretion in allowing consideration of substantial efforts made by the jurisdiction and extenuating circumstances that would allow the use of extended compliance deadlines in a corrective action plan. A jurisdiction is required to demonstrate a substantial effort to be considered for a corrective action plan in the SB 1383 enforcement process. Now, let's talk about the content requirements that needs to be included within the notification of intent to comply. A jurisdiction shall, at a minimum, include the following in its notification submittal. 1. A description with specificity of the continuing violations. 2. A detailed explanation of the reasons, supported by documentation, why the jurisdiction is unable to comply. 3. A description of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on compliance. 4. A description of the proposed actions the jurisdiction will take to remedy the violations within the timelines established in Title 14 California Code of Regulations, Section 18996.2, with a proposed schedule for doing so. The proposed actions shall be tailored to remedy the violations in a timely manner. Additionally, jurisdictions are to adopt a resolution by its respective governing body affirming the contents and timeline of its notification of intent to comply and include the resolution within their notification submission. New since our last webinar that we've had, CalRecycle has developed a resolution template that jurisdictions can utilize that my colleague Kat will talk about later in today's presentation. Additionally, as stated in the previous slide regarding administrative civil penalty relief, for violations of the regulations that are disclosed in the notification and approved by CalRecycle, CalRecycle will waive administrative civil penalties, and penalties will not occur for the outlined violations in the notification during the 2022 calendar year if the jurisdiction implements the proposed actions according to the schedule proposed in the notification. The notification and a resolution adopted by the governing body of the jurisdiction shall be sent to CalRecycle no later than Tuesday, March 1st, 2022. Notifications and the resolutions should be emailed to the notification of intent to comply inbox at noyc@calrecycle.ca.gov. CalRecycle will respond in writing to a jurisdiction's notification submission within 45 business days of receiving the notification with one of the following: an approval, a disapproval, a request for additional information, or a timeline for a decision on approval or disapproval. If CalRecycle disapproves the notification due to the notification not meeting the requirements, CalRecycle will include in the response a justification for the disapproval. I will now hand it over to Kat for a live demonstration of the notification of intent to comply form. And let me give her permissions here. So let us switch over here. Give us a second. All right, Kat, we can see your screen and you could go ahead. I think you could unmute yourself and you could begin.
Perfect. Thank you, Alan, and good morning, everyone. As Alan mentioned, CalRecycle has developed and is providing a notification form as a convenience to assist jurisdictions for purposes of submitting a notification of intent to comply to CalRecycle, as described in Public Resources Code section 42652.5C. I want to point out that use of this form is optional and not a regulatory requirement. I'm going to start by demonstrating where to find information about the notifications on our website. So from the CalRecycle homepage, you'll scroll down to the update section and find new 1383 resources, and you'll click on the Learn More button. This will take you to the short-lived climate pollutant reduction strategy webpage. Next, you will scroll down to the enforcement section and click on the Learn More button. This will take you to the enforcement web pages where you will find the SB 619 Notification of Intent to Comply section. Then you will click on the Learn More button. Now this takes you to the Notification of Intent to Comply with SB 1383 Regulations webpage. Here, you will find information about the notification of intent to comply, including the process, the application form, and a sample resolution. Since our last webinar, CalRecycle posted a sample resolution that jurisdictions could utilize to submit with their notification. We have also posted the first webinar recording and PowerPoint presentation here, and we also plan to post a list of jurisdictions with approved notifications on this page. Once today's presentation and webinar recording have been made ADA compliant, They will also be posted here. To access the form we developed, you'll click on the application form button. So here's what the notification form looks like. The first page of this form summarizes all of the same information Alan covered in the previous slides. So now we'll go down to page 2. And this is where the fillable portion of the form begins. And it begins with administrative information. This includes all the information from jurisdiction name all the way down to phone number. Now for section 1, this is where you'll provide the violations. We provided some checkboxes for ease of identifying some of the most common violations. However, it is not all inclusive. You may select violations using the checkboxes or write in the violations for each application or applicable regulatory section. For each regulatory section selected or written, you will describe the specific violations related to that regulatory section. We have provided an example to give you an idea of what we are expecting in the way of identifying and describing specific violations. We selected letter B, 14 CCR, section 1898.4.1, 3-container organic waste collection services. And we included a description of the violations. The first is not implementing mandatory residential food waste collection for all residents and not implementing mandatory commercial organics collection for all businesses under 2 cubic yards. In our example, we only identified 2 violations, but when using this form, jurisdictions are to list all violations that may apply. So now going down to number 2. Number 2 is where you provide a detailed explanation of the reasons why the jurisdiction is unable to comply, supported by documentation if applicable. And number 3, you'll provide a description of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on compliance. And then in number 4, you'll provide a description of the proposed actions the jurisdiction will take to remedy the violations listed in number 1 above, with a proposed schedule for completing each one. This is to be done for all of the violations identified. We have provided an optional format in this document, so let's take a look at that, and that's located on the last page. So we are looking for tasks associated with remedying the violations and achieving compliance. We have provided examples to give you an idea of what we are expecting in the way of identifying tasks. Using our example in section 1, we had identified section 18984.1, 3-container organic waste collection services, and we identified 2 specific violations. For the first violation identified in our example, we included a description of the specific violation, not implementing mandatory residential food waste collection for all residents. We then identified the tasks that may be needed in order to provide mandatory residential food waste collection. In this example, tasks identified are purchasing additional collection vehicles and working with the hauler to find a facility to accept mixed organic waste. Along with the tasks, we have included their associated completion dates. For the second violation identified in our example, we included a description of the specific violation, not implementing mandatory commercial organics collection for all businesses under 2 cubic yards. We then identified the tasks for that violation and their associated completion dates. Lastly, you will sign the notification form and send it along with the resolution adopted by your governing body to noic@calrecycle.ca.gov no later than March 1st, 2022. This concludes the overview of CalRecycle's Notification of Intent to Comply form.
Thank you, Kat. Let me switch back over to myself here. And thank you, Kat, for that live demo. So for everybody, for more information, we encourage you to subscribe to the SLCP listserv, visit the SLCP homepage on the CalRecycle website, contact your local assistance and market development liaison, or you can email the notification of intent to comply inbox as listed on the screen, which is noic@calrecycle.ca.gov. And additionally, that is also the email inbox that you will be sending your notifications to for submission before March 1st, 2022. Lastly, I want to note that this presentation is a guidance tool developed for information and example purposes only. The disclaimer specifies use of this document is optional. It is not an enforceable regulatory requirement and does not ensure regulatory compliance if it is used. I will now hand it over to Jocelyn to begin the Q&A portion of today's webinar.
Thanks, Alan. Here is a reminder of how the Q&A session will go. If you are watching the webinar via the CalEPA broadcast, you may email your questions to the NOIC inbox. If you are using the GoToWebinar platform, please type your question into the question pane. I will unmute participants in the order that questions come in. Note that you will need to unmute yourself on your end when asked. Please state your name and affiliation before asking your question. Questions and comments regarding the merit of the regulations were responded to during the rulemaking period. Today, we will focus on questions or clarifications regarding the notification of intent to comply. I will now start us off with the first question. So first question is coming from JC Bolden. Give me a second to unmute you. JC, you may ask your question and state your affiliation.
Good morning. I wasn't anticipating this. JC Bolden, SCS Engineers. My quick question was, if a jurisdiction completes the NOIC to the very best of their ability and inadvertently misses one of the many violation opportunities, will CalRecycle staff review that and work with the jurisdiction and allow them the grace and opportunity to amend that to get it correct?
Yeah, good question. I see, Kara, you put your name on there on that question. Did you want to take that? And if there's anything else I could, either Kat and I could add.
Sure. Hey, thanks, Alan. JC, thank you for the question. So if a jurisdiction identifies a violation that it did not include in its notification, it cannot be added after March 1. So what we've been doing is meeting with jurisdictions all across the state to discuss their potential violations and solutions for that violation. So if you have any jurisdictions that you'd like us to have that conversation with prior to March 1, we'd be happy to do so. But a violation cannot be added. Now, if there is a violation that's listed in the notification and there's additional details that CalRecycle needs, then we can tackle that in the notification. But a new violation cannot be added to the application. Did that answer your question, JC?
It did. So just to clarify and summarize, it sounds like it's in every jurisdiction's best interest that is intending to submit a NOIC that they should reach out to their CalRecycle rep for a pre-review. Yes, no, I saw the eyes roll.
Yeah, I don't know that we're saying a pre-review of the application and what you're putting in it, but yes, we should. We would love to meet with any jurisdiction to discuss what they think their violations are, the timeline, when they think they will correct those violations, and then we can discuss potential solutions and such as including that in the notification or not. So yeah, happy to have those conversations. Just contact your LAM's liaison and we will get that set up ASAP because I do appreciate that we're on a tight timeline.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, JC, for your question, and thank you, Kara. Next question is coming from Trevor Blythe. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. But you are unmuted. Please state your city and your question.
Yeah, you nailed the last name. Thanks, Blythe. Trevor Blythe. So I have a question. Basically, if we're looking at more than the year 2022 to wrap up some of the violations that are outlined in the NOIC, does it make sense to include corrective action kind of timelines that extend into 2023? Or are we really looking at for this NOIC to really only outline corrective action plans that happen during 2022?
Yeah, good question, Trevor. And I can take a stab at this. And Karen, Ashley, feel free to chime in if I don't cover something there. So good question, Trevor. We understand, CalRecycle understands that not all violations that jurisdictions are going to be under violation for SB 1383 can be addressed within the 11 months left that are in this calendar year. We are asking that jurisdictions include and outline all of their violations. The schedule aspect and area within the notification will include and potentially include violations that a jurisdiction can address within a week, but maybe some that are going to address that the schedule is going to go into 2023. So once the submission that the jurisdiction submits the notification with all of their violations that they are identifying, with the schedule of how they're going to address them with the specificity similar to what we've discussed during today's webinar. Once that is reviewed by CalRecycle, then we'll evaluate and look at things and see whether a corrective action plan of issuing that for that jurisdiction is best fit for that particular jurisdiction. So that'll be just something that we're asking the jurisdictions to include and just outline their schedule, whether it's going to be addressed in 2022 or 2023 and so forth. Kara, Ashley, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. So something else that may help is, for example, if you put in a timeline within your corrective action plan that you work with us, and for some reason you come across a barrier that you cannot control. So maybe the cart supply. I know we have cart supply question here. Maybe the cart supply is down, or something fell through with an agreement you're making in place. If you let us know ahead of time, well before that timeline is supposed to, or that due date, I guess, for that task is supposed to be there, and you're supposed to have implemented that task, we'll work with you to potentially extend your timeline a little bit further, depending on your situation also. So for any of you who've been in the jurisdiction compliance unit with Alan's team, and you've been on was it a local implementation plan, they have extended timelines for certain reasons. So that's also an option in this too. So we know that sometimes timelines do get messed up, and we are trying to predict the future on when things will occur. But if there is something that is a good reason for your timeline not being met, please contact us as soon as possible, and we'll work with you on adjusting your corrective action plan timeline for that task only, right? If it affects other tasks, then we'll have to explore that more, but we're not saying we'll extend the whole corrective action plan, but at least just for that task. So I hope that also helps, Trevor, in talking about timelines.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification, guys. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Trevor. So next question is coming from Sarah Ahern, I think on behalf of Jill Santos. Jill, you are unmuted. Go ahead and state your affiliation and your question. Okay, I will ask the question on behalf of Jill. So Jill Santos, recycling manager from City of Oxnard. If the city intended to phase in parts of SB 1383 over the course of 2022, so that terms are in progress, how is that going to be managed? Follow-up, acts of God, does that include supply chain issues?
Yeah, and Jill, and I'll say Jill and Sarah, thank you for your question. So similar to Trevor's question there with the timelines and whatnot, I would recommend that jurisdictions outline all of their violations, that if they are planning to go down the path of submitting a notification, to include all of the violations on there, and then with each violation, having that addressed through including a schedule of how they're going to address that violation. Now, there may be some instances where you're mentioning acts of gods or supply chain issues. That's something that the enforcement staff, during the oversight of the implementation of jurisdictions notifications, as we're monitoring that, there will be communication during that process with working with and discussing with the jurisdiction their progress in implementing their violations that they've addressed within the notification. So hopefully that answers your question. Kara, did you want to chime in on anything on that?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ellen, for that explanation. So it's important to note that, these are plans and estimated timelines. So after the corrective action plan is issued, should, as Ashley noted and Alan did as well, should a jurisdiction run into a challenge with achieving a timeline, they will need to communicate that to the enforcement staff. We will then look at the situation and potentially revise that task and timeline in the corrective action plan. The statute does provide CalRecycle with the ability to establish maximum timelines beyond what is provided for in the 1383 regulations. So just really important that as we begin monitoring your implementation of a corrective action plan, if something comes up and you know that you're not going to hit a timeline, you need to contact your enforcement branch staff person that's doing the monitoring so that we can look at the situation and then assess whether or not to modify that task and really the timeline related to that task in the corrective action plan. Thanks, Alan.
Yeah, so Jill and Sarah, hopefully that answers your question. If I know you don't have a mic, but if that doesn't, feel free to touch base with one of us offline after the webinar.
Thanks, Alan and Kara. So next question is coming from Colonel Burnley. I believe it's on behalf of James. Colonel or James, you are unmuted. You may state your affiliation and your question. I will ask the question on behalf of James. So James with the city of Beverly Hills, his question is, what do you do if your city has a plan to be fully rolled out by the end of 2022, but missed a city council date to bring a resolution before March 1st, 2022 deadline for SB 619 NOIC? What do you recommend?
So Kara,
yeah. So that's a great question. First and foremost, if you think you're in that situation, please talk to your land liaison as soon as possible. We need to strategize and understand the situation and why you're not able to bring that resolution to council by the March 1st submittal deadline. So let's talk, let's understand your situation. But let's play this out. Worst case scenario, you are not able to submit the required documents by the due date. If you absolutely were not able to take that resolution to council to get it submitted to us by the March 1 due date, we cannot accept your notification. I mean, that is a requirement that the elected body approve the notification. So in that instance, you would be under the regular 1383 enforcement process as laid out in the regulations. And we can talk about your particular situation and what that means. As we've laid out in our enforcement process document, when CalRecycle conducts a compliance evaluation on your jurisdiction, we would review your implementation and determine, CalRecycle will determine if there are violations. If there are violations, then we would continue down the path laid out in the regulations, determining if an enforcement action is necessary. But again, if you're in this situation, please, let's talk now. Get a call into your local assistance liaison so we can understand your situation and see if there's anything we can do to provide you support. Alan, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, so similar as Kara stated, there is still the normal enforcement process, and when I say normal, it's just the SB 1383 enforcement process that's outlined within the regulations. So if, as Kara mentioned, a resolution is required for approval for all of the notifications that are coming in. So if in this case, if a resolution was not passed and you missed the March 1st deadline, then we would not be able to accept the notification. Although, as Kara stated and outlined in previous webinars, the enforcement process is laid out in a timeline setting where a compliance evaluation would occur on a jurisdiction, and if violations were identified through the compliance evaluation that enforcement staff performs on the jurisdiction, it goes through the NOV process, which is the notice of violation, which gets formally sent over to the jurisdiction, and then it's in that case of the jurisdiction has to implement those violations, to which then, as stated in previous webinars, potentially may go down the CAT process as well. So it is not the end of the road end all if a jurisdiction is not able to do the notification. Obviously, the notification is set up for jurisdictions to provide that administrative civil penalty relief for the calendar year 2022. But as the question was posed, meeting those timelines would need for us being able to approve the notification.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. It's just I brought that up because my window is short and we're operating with little bandwidth. I'm focused on getting it rolled out, so I'm having to stop and focus on prepping and getting the resolution done to make that deadline while I'm in the middle of trying to roll out the program. So I just want to make sure I focus my attention where it needs to be focused because we're operating with small bandwidth. And I appreciate all you guys' work and effort and assistance. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I completely appreciate, I mean, this has been a huge lift. Adding 619, I know, is another huge lift. So, if the local assistance team has not already, kind of met with you and talked about your situation, I will make sure that they follow up today with you, and we'll get something scheduled so we can chat about your particular situation and offer any assistance that we can. But thank you so much for all that you're doing. Ashley?
Yeah, no, just real quick, no, they both been great. I'm in direct communication with them, so they both, Primitivo and Mia, is doing a great job.
And I think something else to consider is, I know we have a situation out there where the resolution may be signed really close to March 1st or maybe March 2nd, but they have already presented it to council and it's already in draft form. So those are things that Kara and her team will also talk to you about too, is, what happens if you get it signed March 1st at 5 p.m., right? Would we accept it, and those types of things. So I know those scenarios have also come up. So I know Kara and her team know how to handle that one. And so I know they look forward to talking with you, and hopefully we could get everything squared away.
And then also just to remind everybody, with the resolution, CalRecycle has developed a resolution template that jurisdictions can utilize that potentially may help speed up just the process of just utilizing the template process and having that. So it'll be different case by case of what jurisdictions, but that is something that the department did put out just to assist jurisdictions in covering their resolution requirement as required by the notification submission. Thanks. Jocelyn, next question.
Next question is coming from Lillian Clark. Lillian, I've unmuted you. Please unmute yourself, state your affiliation and your question.
Hi, I was just wondering in our NOIC if we should add the statement in there about the supply chain issues, because it could impact when programs start.
Yeah, good question, Lillian. It's kind of similar to I believe Trevor's question that we chimed in on. But yes, so if there are backlogs and supply chain issues regarding carts, that would mean that there would be generators that are required to have organic collection service, not have service, so that would be the violation. So that's kind of the domino effect of not being able to implement the program. I would recommend including that on there and having the schedule and having that just so it's identified. That way the department is in the understanding that the city is going through issues with carts and bins, just to put it on the radar so that when we perform a compliance evaluation and we're looking at organic waste generators, and we don't see a bin there, and there is nothing that may be tied into that of how that's being impacted on the program.
Yeah, and the haulers are also saying that it's impacting trucks. So if they need to increase their routes, they're having a hard time getting new trucks. So just letting you guys know.
Mhm. Yes.
Yeah, and to add to that, Alan, I think it's really important as you provide the timeline and your best estimate. If you give us an estimate that seems like it's really far out there for something that normally wouldn't be, just include a note in your application, as Alan noted, explaining that the reason for this timeline is, the haulers talked to the vendor, and this is the date that the vendor is saying that truck, right, can be delivered. So any supporting documentation like that is what's needed with your application. And then that will help us, as Alan noted, as we're monitoring the implementation of your tasks and timelines. If you're running into that date's coming up and you're hearing from the vendor that, oh, it's going to be 2 more months, et cetera, communicating that to the enforcement branch, providing them, whatever information, say you had from that vendor, will provide that necessary documentation. Then, as we talked about earlier, we will then evaluate that and then potentially change the timeline in the corrective action plan. And again, CalRecycle has the ability to go beyond what's laid out in the regulation, and we can establish a maximum timeline. We have that flexibility, and that's 619 has provided that to CalRecycle through that statute. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kara. Our next question is coming from Annika Anderson. Annika, I've unmuted you. Please unmute yourself, state your affiliation and your question.
Okay, so that is in follow-up to actual question. Is any violation identified on the knowing to be later violation regulation? Those violations corrective action NO cycle.
Yeah, so Annika, you were breaking up a little bit, but I am reading your question just to kind of fill in the gap. So from what I heard, just for everybody so they know, the question was for any violations that are not identified on the NOINC, the notification, and are found to be out of compliance, will those violations go through the normal corrective action process? So there's a couple of things there of the interpretation, and I'll do my best to look at both scenarios. So from how I'm reading the question is the jurisdiction identified their violations within the notification, but upon a compliance evaluation that the department does upon the jurisdiction, if we find additional violations that are not identified in the notification, how will those violations be addressed through the department? So that's how I'm understanding the question, Annika. And I don't know if you could hear me or not because you were breaking up, but I'll answer it in that form and fashion. So those violations would go through the traditional SB 1383 enforcement process, which would include identifying those violations through the compliance evaluation, and then going through the notice of violation, the NOV, and then potentially a corrective action plan if it was not addressed through the NOV by the jurisdiction. So Annika, I hope that's kind of my inkling as I was saying your question out loud, and I don't know if you could still hear me, but does that answer your question, Annika? So I'm going to give my benefit of the doubt and say that did. Annika, if it did not, feel free to follow up with us offline.
Thanks, Alan. Our next question is coming from Stephanie Mejia. Stephanie, you are unmuted. Please unmute yourself, state your affiliation and your question.
Hi, this is Stephanie from the city of Palmdale. My question is if a jurisdiction, can a jurisdiction have the date to be completed in NOIC listed as 12/31/2022 for all violations listed, or do we have to give you specific dates throughout the year?
Yeah, I guess to answer your question, depending on what the violations are and if the jurisdiction believes that 12/31/2022 would be that would be the date that the violations would be addressed, and there was the description and schedule for doing so. I guess it's a case by case, but to answer your question, generally yes. But if one of the violations was something that would be more reasonable to address within 2 or 3 months, that may be a question that we may follow up with the jurisdiction on. Why does this take, all the way up till the end of the year? If this something is typically a normal task, that a violation that a jurisdiction typically can handle within 2 or 3 months. So just ensure that when jurisdictions, and as a reminder, that the schedule and the dates that jurisdictions are including to address the violations, that they're reasonable and feasible and the dates make sense. So we wouldn't want to be reviewing notifications if the jurisdiction just thought it was easier just to put the same date all the way down across the board, but that date didn't really correlate with addressing the violation. Does that make sense, Stephanie?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, for your question, and thank you, Alan. Next question is coming from Monique Gamma. Monique, I will just go ahead and read her question since they're in listen-only mode. We report as a GPA for our jurisdiction. Do we submit a NOIC separately, or should we be submitting one altogether?
Yeah, so GPA doesn't resonate off the top of my head, but I'm assuming that that's kind of that's a regional agency. So as a reminder, SB 1383, the responsibility for implementation of 1383 lands on the individual jurisdictions. When we're going through our enforcement process, we are enforcing upon individual jurisdictions and not the entire regional agency. So each individual jurisdiction should be submitting a notification if that applies to them to go through that process individually. So Monique, hopefully that answers your question. If not, if there was a different definition for GPA, feel free to touch with us offline.
Thank you, Alan. Our next question is coming from the NOIC inbox from Kim Nielsen. Sorry, I think that's how you pronounce her last name. Sorry. Her question is, if a jurisdiction has an ordinance in place before March 1st, all programs moving forward, do they need a NOIC?
Yeah, that's a good question, Kim. And my answer to that is, if the jurisdiction does not have any violations and they have their program up and running, might not make sense to submit a NOIC. But if a jurisdiction has an ordinance, has programs moving forward, but still has violations because there's still gaps in there that need to be addressed, then that would probably fit more so for submitting a notification. So it's really a case by case. The NOIC is not required for submission by jurisdictions. It's just an avenue and a path where a jurisdiction can submit a notification if they're finding violations. So if you want to talk more offline, Kim, and I would recommend talking to your local assistance representative who would have more information and how your programs are set up specifically in your jurisdiction, definitely touch base with them and have a conversation with them of potentially what may or may not make sense if a submission of a notification makes sense for your jurisdiction.
Thank you, Alan. Our next question is coming from Sharon Mitchell. I will just go ahead and read off her question. Her question is, do you expect that there will be enough compost available for all jurisdictions to meet their organic waste product procurement targets? If not, should the organic waste procurement target sections of the regulations be included in a jurisdiction's NOIC?
Yeah, I might have to divert to either Kara or Ashley, who have more of a pulse on the statewide aspect of what's going on within the state. Do you mind reading the question again, Jocelyn, just for out loud?
Sure. The question is, do you expect that there will be enough compost available for all jurisdictions to meet their organic waste product procurement targets? If not, should the organic waste procurement target sections of the regulations be included in a jurisdiction's NOIC?
Hey, thank you so much for that question. You have some nuances in your question, which make it a little challenging to respond kind of generally across the board. The availability of compost is going to vary depending on where you are in the state. We do expect as collection programs come, more and more programs come online this year, there's going to be more compost produced, right? And also, remember that the original procurement target was based upon the amount of material that would be collected and then processed in the year 2025. So, these first couple of years, we see procurement and the supply, market chain supply ramping up. And so right now in the first year of implementation, there may not be enough supply of a particular organic waste product. Could be renewable natural gas, could be in the form of electricity or in the form of compost or mulch. So, I think, again, it would be great to have a conversation with your land liaison to discuss your particular situation. But if you were working on your procurement target, if you are setting your baseline, if you are assessing what all the departments are procuring currently and what they will be able to procure, if you are working with direct service providers to look at opportunities for procuring material, if you are exploring some creative solutions such as maybe compost giveaways, etc., that's what we're going to be looking for. We recognize that the procurement target, achieving that target in the first year, particularly maybe year two, is going to be challenging. So we'd like to know what your particular situation is. We'd also like to offer you solutions, what other jurisdictions are doing creatively to address the situation. And to that end, we are planning on hosting a webinar to share what jurisdictions are doing to implement their procurement program. But we do recognize that procurement, if that is your only gap in your implementation, then the tool of 619 may not be the most appropriate vehicle for you because it's related to supply chain issues, and the notification is intended to identify specific tasks and timelines on how you're going to cure the violation. You may not be able to cure the violation if it's related to supply, market supply. So again, these are very nuanced conversations that we would need to talk to you specifically about and help determine, what solution makes sense. Ashley?
Thanks, Kara. And to play a little devil's advocate with Kara, it is completely up to you guys as a jurisdiction. If you feel like even if procurement is your only violation, right, and you want to submit the 619 application, feel free to do so, right? This is something, like I said earlier, is if it is your supply chain and if you said you'd have it by the end of 2022 and it's still not there and it's not going to be there, talk to us about extending those timelines. So this is an opportunity you could potentially use, even if it's something that it's still kind of uncertain when those timelines are, but at least you'll have maybe a better handle of what it looks like in summer. This is up to you guys if you want that, protection. So again, I would reach out to Kara and her staff, talk about your specific scenario. Maybe there are options to use a direct service provider, so not even in your area. So those are some things that Kara and her team will talk about. But again, submitting the 619 application process is completely up to all of your jurisdictions that you guys represent. And we only could give some recommendations, but ultimately the decision is up to you guys.
Thank you, Ashley, Karen, Alan. Our next question is coming from Virginia. Virginia Fowler, I've unmuted you. Please unmute yourself, state your affiliation and your question. Okay, I will go ahead and ask the question for her. So it's coming from Virginia Fowler. Her question is, if the jurisdiction is making a good effort to comply and well on its way to comply with all requirements and will have them completed by 2023 or before, is there still a need to submit a NOIC? I understand that CalRecycle will only issue NOV and enforce to those that are serious offenders.
Yeah, so Virginia, a couple of elements there that are wrapped in there. So I did hear good effort, which kind of ties in, and when I hear that, it's the good faith effort. So as a reminder to all jurisdictions, SB 1383 does not have good faith effort wrapped into it. That was eliminated, so it's either it's being implemented or it's not being implemented. You did pose that if a jurisdiction is implementing its 1383 program, is there a need to submit a notification? To that answer, if a jurisdiction is implementing all elements and does not have violations, probably isn't a whole need for submission of a notification if there are no violations. I would definitely recommend, Virginia, talking to your local assistance representative who would have a better understanding and idea of your programs and implementation of, and then having that conversation of if it makes sense to submit a notification for your situation in the jurisdiction. The last statement I believe that was in your question is CalRecycle will only issue NOVs and enforce to those that are serious offenders. So the enforcement process as it's written within the regulations, it is enforcement's duty to identify all violations within implementation of a jurisdiction's 1383 program. Although, as we've stated in previous webinars, the department has the flexibility to utilize enforcement discretion. So it's really a case-by-case situation on jurisdictions, and we will use that discretion based off of what's being provided with the jurisdiction. And do know that the enforcement process that CalRecycle is going to be implementing, there is going to be lots of communication that the enforcement team will be having upon with jurisdictions. So it won't be it won't be a one-sided conversation. There will be conversation that'll be occurring back and forth. So Virginia, hopefully that answers your question. And I'm looking at the time. That's probably the last question that we'll be able to get to today. So with that, there are still some questions that are out there that were submitted through the inbox as well as the question pane. There will be answers to those questions will be provided, and we will follow up with those who were not able to get to during today's webinar. So rest assured, somebody will reach out and provide a response to your questions that you've submitted. So with that, I want to thank everybody for participating and joining in on today's webinar. Ashley, Kara, any final words on the webinar? Otherwise, I will say final words and say thank you, everybody. Have a great day and stay safe.